Nestled within the remote, mist-shrouded valleys of southeastern Kentucky, where the ancient Appalachian Mountains stand as silent guardians against the horizon, lies a cemetery you will find on no surveyor's map. The local residents know it as the Garden of Purified Angels, a name few dare to whisper outside the safety of their own homes. In this forgotten patch of earth, between the years 1834 and 1859, the tiny bodies of 156 infants were laid to rest in secret. These children were not buried by their grieving mothers and fathers, but by the very women who had ushered them into this world. The Morrison sisters, Margaret, Catherine, and Agnes, were celebrated as the most gifted midwives across 3 counties, renowned for having safely delivered over 800 newborns throughout their quarter-century of service. But a recently uncovered set of journals, hidden for more than 150 years within the walls of their former homestead, has torn away this veneer of sanctity. They reveal a truth so profoundly disturbing that it shatters our understanding of faith, the practice of medicine, and the sacred trust bestowed upon those who help bring new life into the world. These meticulously kept records detail a campaign of systematic infanticide, disguised by its perpetrators as divine intervention. These were women utterly convinced they were saving humanity from children they believed were marked by evil. Before we delve into the horrifying specifics of what the Morrison sisters referred to as their holy work, I need to ask you directly. Do you have the fortitude to hear the complete and unvarnished truth? This channel was not made for a casual audience, it exists for those with the courage to unearth the darkest secrets buried within America's past. If you possess the strength to learn about the Morrison sisters' twisted mission, then hit that subscribe button and comment below, telling us what state you're listening from. Few channels dare to bring you the kinds of stories we uncover here, and this one will test the resolve of even the strongest among you. Let's discover together what drove 3 God-fearing women to commit acts so heinous that their own community would have hanged them from the nearest oak tree had the truth been known. Now, allow me to guide you back through time, to the misty hollows of Kentucky, where the Morrison sisters began their reign of terror, meticulously disguised as mercy. The year 1834 marked a pivotal moment for the isolated mountain communities of Harlan County, Kentucky. This was a hard land, where devout Baptist and Methodist families had carved their existence from an unforgiving wilderness. Here, the nearest doctor was a 3-day ride away, and the arrival of a skilled midwife could truly mean the difference between life and death for a mother and her child. In this harsh landscape, the Morrison sisters had established themselves as nothing short of indispensable. Their reputation was built upon a foundation of years of successful deliveries and their unwavering, visible devotion to their Baptist faith. Margaret Morrison, the eldest at 42, possessed hands that many believed were guided by divine providence itself. Her graying hair was perpetually drawn back in a severe bun, and her pale blue eyes held an intensity that was often mistaken for profound religious fervor. She spoke in measured, deliberate tones, quoting scripture with the precision of a seasoned preacher, and carried herself with the authority of one who had stared down death countless times and emerged victorious. Catherine, 38, served as the practical, sturdy backbone of their operation. Her sturdy frame and auburn hair gave her a somewhat masculine appearance, which was belied by her famously gentle touch with laboring mothers, a quality that earned her deep trust. Agnes, the youngest at 35, possessed an ethereal, almost otherworldly beauty. Her dark, flowing hair and large, expressive eyes lent her an angelic quality that many remarked upon, though her soft, soothing voice carried an unsettling, indefinable undercurrent that few could properly articulate. Their home was a modest, 2-story cabin perched on a ridge overlooking the Cumberland River, its weathered logs bearing silent witness to countless mountain storms. This structure served as both their residence and their medical facility. The lower floor was converted into a dedicated birthing room, outfitted with specially crafted beds, surgical instruments ordered all the way from Louisville, and an extensive collection of medicinal herbs cultivated in their carefully tended garden. The upper floor housed their personal quarters and what they called their prayer room, a space dedicated to their increasingly fanatical and isolated interpretation of Baptist doctrine. The Appalachian communities they served were deeply devout, seeing God's hand in every facet of their lives, from the success of their crops to the safe delivery of their children. The Morrison sisters understood this spiritual landscape intimately. They wove their services seamlessly into the fabric of their patients' lives, leading prayers during difficult labors, quoting scripture to comfort anxious fathers, and offering what appeared to be profound spiritual guidance to families facing the perilous uncertainties of childbirth. Their practice stretched across 3 counties, reaching families scattered throughout the Cumberland Gap region. Word of their unparalleled skill spread through the mountains like wildfire, carried by grateful mothers who credited the sisters with saving their lives and the lives of their babies. They charged modest fees, often accepting payment in livestock, vegetables, or household goods, a practice that endeared them to the impoverished mountain families who might otherwise have faced childbirth without any skilled assistance at all. The sisters' daily routine was a testament to their deep religious convictions. They rose before dawn for private prayer, spent their mornings tending their medicinal garden, and devoted their afternoons to visiting expectant mothers or studying the medical texts Margaret had acquired from a retiring doctor in Lexington. Their evenings were reserved for what they termed spiritual preparation, intense prayer sessions where they sought divine guidance for their calling. It was during these secluded evening sessions that their interpretation of Scripture began to evolve in a direction that would have horrified their fellow Baptist congregants. The very isolation of the mountains fostered the sisters' growing separation from conventional religious thought. The harsh winters, treacherous terrain, and weeks of separation from other families created a perfect environment where extreme beliefs could fester and flourish unchecked. Gradually, the Morrison sisters began to see themselves as divinely appointed guardians of spiritual purity, tasked with a sacred duty to protect the world from what they believed were signs of demonic influence manifesting in newborn children. Their metamorphosis from respected midwives to something far more sinister began not with a dramatic event, but with a subtle, creeping shift in perception. It started with their interpretation of birthmarks, which they began to view not as natural variations, but as literal marks of the devil. A strawberry birthmark on a child's forehead became a sign of an unholy, bloodthirsty nature. A port wine stain on an infant's cheek was interpreted as a clear brand of spiritual corruption. What began as troubling observations slowly crystallized into a systematic belief that certain children were born already claimed by evil forces. The isolated nature of their practice provided the perfect cover for their developing delusions. When a child was born with what they considered a mark of the devil, they would calmly dismiss family members from the birthing room, claiming the need for a private medical procedure. The trusting families, exhausted from the ordeal of labor and profoundly grateful for the sisters' expertise, rarely questioned these requests. This simple, cruel deception was the beginning of what would become their most horrifying legacy. The first recorded purification, as the sisters would later term it in their journals, occurred on a bitter February night in 1834. Sarah Mackenzie, a 19-year-old mother expecting her first child, had been laboring for nearly 18 hours within the sisters' cabin. A howling wind rattled the window panes while snow piled high against the doors, creating a cocoon of isolation that seemed to amplify every gasp and moan within the small birthing room. As the clock struck midnight, Margaret Morrison, her hands stained with blood and her face glistening with perspiration, finally delivered the infant. The baby boy emerged into the world healthy and crying with a strong voice. But as Agnes cleaned him by the flickering lamplight, her movements suddenly stilled. She had noticed a large, dark birthmark covering nearly half of his left cheek. The mark was irregularly shaped, resembling what the more superstitious mountain folk might call a devil's handprint. Agnes held the child closer to the dancing flame, her eyes widening as she examined the mark more closely. She exchanged a single, meaningful glance with Margaret, who immediately moved to examine the infant herself. "Sister," Agnes whispered, her voice barely audible above the keening wind. "Look at this mark. It's not natural. It's too dark, too perfect. It is a sign of evil." Margaret took the baby, studying the birthmark with growing alarm. To her fevered imagination, the mark seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, and she began to see patterns within its borders that suggested hidden, demonic symbols. From the bed, Sarah Mackenzie, exhausted and delirious from her prolonged ordeal, called out weakly, "Is my baby all right? Why isn't he crying anymore?" The sisters had instinctively moved to the far corner of the room, speaking in hushed, urgent tones while the infant, now ignored, lay wrapped in a blanket, his cries gradually subsiding. Margaret's mind raced as she stared at the birthmark. Years of intense, obsessive biblical study had filled her thoughts with vivid imagery of spiritual warfare, and she began to interpret this mark not as a simple vascular flaw, but as irrefutable evidence of demonic possession. She recalled passages from Revelation concerning the mark of the beast and saw terrifying parallels. "Catherine," she called to her sister, who was tending to the fading Sarah. "Come here immediately. You need to see this." Catherine approached, wiping her hands on her blooded apron, and let out a sharp gasp when she saw the birthmark. The three sisters huddled together, their faces illuminated by the dancing lamplight as they whispered fervently about the spiritual implications of what they were seeing. In their increasingly shared delusion, they began to believe they were witnessing a literal manifestation of evil, that this innocent child had been marked by Satan himself. "We cannot allow this abomination to enter the world," Margaret declared, her voice trembling with religious fervor. "God has placed this child in our hands for a reason. We must purify him before his corruption can spread to others." Agnes nodded, her angelic features twisting with a misguided, terrible conviction. "It would be a mercy," she whispered, "to save him from a life of evil, and to save others from his influence." What happened next would haunt the Morrison sisters for the remainder of their days, though they would never confess it was wrong. Margaret, believing she was performing a divine service, placed her hands firmly over the infant's nose and mouth. The baby struggled briefly, a tiny, frantic movement, before his movement ceased, his body going limp in her arms. The sisters then turned their attention to Sarah Mackenzie, who had mercifully lost consciousness from exhaustion and blood loss. When Sarah awakened hours later, Margaret approached her bedside, her face a mask of carefully practiced grief. "I'm so sorry, dear," she said, her voice heavy with false sorrow. "Your baby was born with terrible complications. His pure spirit was called home to be with the Lord before he could suffer in this world. Sometimes God takes the most pure ones early, to spare them from earthly trials." Sarah's anguished cries echoed through the wooden cabin as the sisters surrounded her, speaking in soothing tones of God's mysterious ways and the blessing of knowing her child was safe in heaven. The infant was buried that same night in a small, unmarked grave behind the Morrison cabin, the first of many that would eventually form their secret cemetery. The sisters marked the spot with a simple wooden cross and held a brief prayer service, convincing themselves completely that they had performed a sacred duty. They recorded the event in a journal Margaret had begun keeping, writing in her careful, precise script, February 12, 1834. "Purified one marked by darkness. The Lord's work continues." As a cold dawn broke over the snow-blanketed mountains, the sisters began to meticulously craft their story for the outside world. They told Sarah's husband, Thomas, that the baby had been born with severe, internal defects that made survival impossible. They described fictional complications that sounded medically plausible to uneducated mountain folk, and they generously offered to handle all burial arrangements as a gesture of Christian charity. Thomas, grief-stricken and trusting, accepted their explanation without question, and even thanked them for their kindness in sparing his wife the sight of their deformed child. The disturbing ease with which they had deceived the grieving parents both unsettled and emboldened the Morrison sisters. They began to view their deception as a divinely inspired component of their sacred mission. Over the following days, they refined their explanations and practiced their expressions of sympathy, mentally preparing for the future purifications they now believed were inevitable. Word of the Mackenzie baby's death spread through the tight-knit mountain communities, as such tragic news always did. The high rate of infant mortality in the region made the sisters' story entirely believable, and their reputation for skill and compassion actually grew, as people praised their gentle handling of the tragedy. But the Morrison sisters had crossed a moral threshold from which there would be no return. They had tasted the intoxicating power of playing God, of making life-and-death decisions based on their twisted interpretation of divine will. The first murder had been committed in a moment of religious hysteria, but it would not be the last. In their private moments, they began to discuss the possibility that other children might be born with similar marks of evil, and they started to develop a cold, systematic approach to identifying and eliminating what they saw as threats to the spiritual purity of their world. The transformation was complete. The Morrison sisters were no longer midwives guided by medical knowledge and Christian compassion. They had become something far more sinister, self-appointed agents of divine judgment, convinced that they alone possessed the wisdom to determine which children deserved to live and which should be purified before they could corrupt the world with their presence. The months following the Mackenzie tragedy marked a period of disturbing theological evolution for the Morrison sisters. What had begun as a single act of murderous delusion gradually hardened into a systematic doctrine of infanticide. They spent countless hours in their secluded prayer room, poring over scripture and developing increasingly elaborate justifications for their actions. Margaret, as the eldest and most educated, became the primary architect of their twisted dogma, while Catherine and Agnes served as her eager disciples, validating and expanding upon her interpretations. Their study of biblical texts took on an obsessive, frantic quality. They focused with laser intensity on passages dealing with spiritual purity, divine judgment, and the corruption of innocence. Margaret began to see connections, wholly imaginary, between birthmarks, physical defects, and spiritual contamination. She compiled a detailed catalogue of what she termed demonic markings, a comprehensive list of physical characteristics that she believed indicated infernal influence. According to their growing, malignant doctrine, strawberry birthmarks were signs of a bloodthirsty nature. Port wine stains indicated an inherent propensity for violence. Any unusual coloring or texture of the skin was deemed evidence of a demonic touch. They expanded their deadly criteria to include physical defects such as cleft palates, extra fingers or toes, and any form of visible deformity. In their twisted logic, these conditions were not natural variations, but literal manifestations of evil that required immediate purification. Ironically, the sisters' reputation in the mountain communities continued to grow, enhanced by their careful, cynical management of the tragedies they themselves created. They had learned to present infant deaths as the inscrutable will of God, speaking eloquently about His mysterious ways and the blessing of sparing imperfect children from earthly suffering. Their apparent expertise in handling such heartbreaking situations actually increased demand for their services, as families came to believe the Morrison sisters possessed special wisdom concerning the mysteries of life and death. Throughout 1834 and 1835, the sisters performed dozens of legitimate, successful deliveries, caring for mothers and babies with genuine skill and compassion. But when infants were born with what they considered demonic markings, the routine became horrifyingly predictable. They would dismiss family members, claiming medical necessity, and then perform their swift, silent purification ritual. The babies would be suffocated quickly, their struggles brief and unnoticed by exhausted mothers in the dim, chaotic birthing rooms. The sisters developed an elaborate system of lies to explain these deaths to grieving families. They invented fictional medical conditions with impressively Latin-sounding names, described imaginary complications that required immediate intervention, and offered detailed, pseudo-medical explanations about why the babies could not possibly survive. Their genuine medical knowledge, combined with their aura of religious authority, made their stories completely believable to the uneducated, trusting mountain folk who had little choice but to rely on their expertise. Agnes proved to be particularly skilled at comforting the bereaved parents. Her angelic appearance and soft, melodic voice provided a profound solace to families shattered by loss. She would spend hours with grieving mothers, reading scripture and offering theological explanations for their suffering. Her genuine-seeming tears and apparent empathy masterfully masked the horrifying fact that she had helped orchestrate the very tragedies she was now counseling others to accept. Catherine took upon herself the grim, practical responsibility for their secret cemetery. She selected a secluded area behind their cabin, hidden by a dense thicket of forest and accessible only through a narrow, disguised path known only to the sisters. She dug the tiny graves herself, working by the faint light of the moon to avoid detection, and created a careful, coded record of each burial location. The cemetery began to take on the deceptive appearance of a small, wild garden, with Catherine planting native flowers and herbs around the gravesites to create the illusion of natural, undisturbed growth. The sisters' journal entries from this period reveal both the profound depth of their delusion and the chillingly systematic nature of their crimes. Margaret wrote extensively about their divine mission, describing each purification as a vital victory against demonic forces. She recorded detailed observations about the physical characteristics of their victims, noting patterns that existed only in her own imagination. Her entries became increasingly elaborate, saturated with religious imagery and biblical quotations that she wielded to justify their actions. As their murderous practice expanded, the sisters even began to develop preferences for certain types of markings. They seemed particularly disturbed by birthmarks on the face or hands, which they believed indicated that the child would use those very features to actively spread evil influence. They also showed special, paranoid concern for babies born with unusual coloring, such as the blue-tinged skin that sometimes resulted from minor circulation issues during birth, a condition they interpret as a celestial rejection. The profound isolation of their mountain practice provided a perfect, enduring cover for their activities. Families lived far apart, communication was slow and limited, and the generally high infant mortality rate made additional deaths seem unremarkable. The sisters' sterling reputation for skill and compassion actually worked in their favor, as grieving parents found a perverse comfort in believing that their babies had been attended by the most capable midwives in the entire region. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the sisters' growing, unshakable sense of divine approval. They began to interpret mundane coincidences and natural events as clear signs of God's pleasure with their work. A successful harvest following a purification was seen as a divine blessing. A difficult winter that claimed the lives of several adults was interpreted as punishment for those who had subtly questioned their judgment. They created an elaborate, self-reinforcing system of supernatural cause and effect that continually validated their belief in their sacred, murderous mission. By the end of 1835, the Morrison sisters had murdered 12 infants. Each death was carefully documented in their journal, and each tiny victim was buried in their expanding secret cemetery. They had perfected their methods, refined their lies, and convinced themselves utterly that they were performing the most important work of their lives. The transformation from skilled midwives to systematic killers was complete, and they showed no signs of questioning their actions or considering the terrifying possibility that they might be monstrously wrong. The stage was now set for 2 more decades of horror that would claim the lives of over 150 innocent children, all carried out in the name of religious purity and divine judgment. The Morrison sisters had become something unprecedented in American criminal history. Female serial killers who wielded their medical expertise and religious authority to commit acts of unspeakable evil, all while maintaining the complete trust and respect of their community. The year 1840 brought with it an unexpected and dangerous complication to the Morrison sisters' carefully orchestrated reign of terror. Rebecca Whitmore, a 23-year-old mother from a prominent and educated Methodist family, had requested their services for the birth of her 3rd child. The Whitmores were known throughout the region not just for their standing, but for their literacy and their connections to the growing Methodist movement, which emphasized personal spiritual experience and social reform. Unlike many of their previous clients, Rebecca possessed both a sharp intellect and a naturally questioning nature, a combination that would prove perilous to the sisters' secret operations. The delivery unfolded on a sweltering July evening, with thunder rumbling ominously in the distance and the air thick and heavy with the promise of a coming storm. Rebecca's labor progressed normally until the moment of birth, when her daughter emerged with a distinctive birthmark covering her left shoulder and upper arm. The mark was a deep, wine red and was roughly shaped like a crescent moon, clearly visible and unmistakably what the Morrison sisters classified as a sign of demonic influence. Margaret immediately recognized the birthmark as fitting their deadly criteria for purification. But Rebecca's alertness and education presented a unique and formidable challenge. Unlike their usual clients, who were often exhausted and trusting, Rebecca remained fully conscious and assertive throughout the entire process. She insisted on holding her daughter immediately after the birth, examining the baby with a critical eye while the sisters exchanged a series of worried, frantic glances. "What is this mark on her shoulder?" Rebecca asked, her voice sharp with maternal concern. "Is it something that will affect her health?" Margaret began to formulate one of their standard explanations involving spiritual corruption, but Rebecca's knowledge, gained from her educated upbringing, allowed her to recognize the birthmark for what it was, a common and harmless condition. "This is simply a strawberry hemangioma," Rebecca declared, using precise medical terminology that startled the sisters. "My cousin in Louisville had one very similar. It will fade as she grows older and poses no threat whatsoever to her health." She clutched her daughter protectively to her chest, her eyes moving suspiciously between the three sisters as she noted their unusually tense behavior. For the first time in their murderous career, the sisters found themselves in an unprecedented and untenable situation. Their standard methods of deception would not work on an educated woman who understood basic medical principles. They could not plausibly claim the birthmark indicated fatal complications, nor could they convince Rebecca that her daughter was suffering from some mysterious, life-threatening condition. They were forced, with simmering frustration, to complete a delivery without performing their purification ritual. Agnes attempted to salvage the situation by pivoting from medical to spiritual concerns. Sometimes these marks indicate spiritual challenges that the child will face, she suggested carefully, her voice a soft, insidious melody. We should perform special prayers to protect her from evil influences. But Rebecca, secure in her Methodist faith and confident in her medical knowledge, dismissed such superstitions as outdated, backward thinking. My daughter is perfectly healthy and blessed by God, Rebecca stated firmly, her tone brooking no argument. I will not have her subjected to unnecessary rituals or treatments. She named the baby Grace and insisted on taking her home immediately, despite the sisters' weak protests that she needed more time to recover from the rigors of birth. The Morrison sisters could only watch in helpless, seething dread as Rebecca departed with her marked child, carrying what they believed to be a living vessel of evil influence out into their community. This failure to perform what they saw as their divine duty filled them with a corrosive anxiety. They spent the following days in intense prayer and frantic consultation, trying to decipher how God could have allowed such a blatant setback to their sacred mission. Margaret's journal entries from this period reveal her growing paranoia and her obsessive fixation on the Whitmore case. She wrote extensive passages about the spiritual dangers of allowing marked children to survive, spinning elaborate theories about how Grace Whitmore's birthmark might act as a corrupting influence on other children in the region. She became utterly convinced that their failure to purify the child would inevitably lead to a dramatic increase in demonic activity throughout their beloved mountains. Over the following months, the sisters began to monitor the Whitmore family with an obsessive, unhealthy focus. They manufactured excuses to visit Rebecca, ostensibly to check on her recovery, but in reality to observe Grace's development with a critical, fearful eye. They watched for any sign of evil influence, interpreting every normal aspect of infant behavior as potential evidence of demonic activity. When Grace smiled, they saw it as evidence of unholy joy. When she cried, they interpreted it as the voice of evil demanding attention. The sisters' fixation on the Whitmore case began to poison their judgment in all other situations. They became increasingly paranoid about their own ability to identify marked children, developing more elaborate and expansive criteria for purification. They began to classify minor physical variations, a slightly asymmetrical ear, a birth mole smaller than a pea, as potential signs of demonic influence. Their paranoia had transformed them from selective killers into indiscriminate murderers who saw existential threats in the most mundane of physical characteristics. The sisters also began to envelop their purifications in increasingly elaborate rituals. Convinced that their previous methods had been insufficient to fully cleanse the spiritual contamination, they created detailed ceremonies involving specific prayers, scripture readings, and what they called purification blessings that were performed over each victim before and after death. These rituals served to further distance them from the brutal reality of their actions, sanctifying murder with the trappings of religious ceremony. But the Whitmore case had planted a seed of corrosive doubt that would continue to grow in the dark corners of their minds. They had been forced to confront the possibility that their divine mission might not be as clear-cut as they had once believed. They began to question whether they were correctly interpreting God's will, whether their criteria for identifying marked children were comprehensive enough, and whether their methods of purification were sufficiently thorough. These doubts manifested in increasingly erratic and divisive behavior. The sisters began to contradict each other about specific cases, arguing vehemently over whether particular children qualified for purification. They developed complex, bureaucratic systems for confirming their decisions, requiring unanimous agreement before proceeding with any purification. They also began to second-guess their past actions, lying awake at night and wondering if they had made catastrophic errors in judgment that might have dire spiritual consequences. The immense psychological strain of their secret activities, combined with the persistent stress of the Whitmore case, began to take its toll on the sisters' mental health. Margaret developed a severe, grinding insomnia and began to experience what she described as divine visions that provided her with direct guidance about their mission. Catherine became increasingly withdrawn and sullen, spending long hours in solitary prayer and showing unmistakable signs of a deep depression. Agnes began to display symptoms of outright religious hysteria, speaking in tongues during their prayer sessions and claiming to receive direct communications from angels. By 1842, the Morrison Sisters had devolved from confident instruments of divine will into paranoid, obsessive murderers who lived in constant, gnawing fear of both earthly discovery and divine judgment. Their failure to purify Grace Whitmore had shattered their sense of infallibility and forced them to confront the terrifying possibility that their entire mission was fundamentally flawed. But rather than abandoning their deadly activities, they doubled down on their commitment to purification. Convinced that their previous failures were the result of insufficient dedication rather than flawed beliefs, they plunged forward into the most intensive period of their murderous career, trapped in a self-perpetuating cycle of religious delusion and murderous compulsion. The winter of 1847 marked a critical turning point, a night that would nearly expose their horrific secret to the light. Mary Catherine Sullivan, a 16-year-old Irish immigrant who had arrived in the mountains with her husband Patrick seeking refuge from the potato famine, was expecting their first child. A brutal February cold snap had trapped most families indoors, and the birth took place during a blizzard that howled through the mountains like a tormented spirit, with snow piling so deep that the sisters had to struggle to the Sullivan cabin on snowshoes. The isolation was absolute, no neighbors could venture out, and the nearest settlement was completely cut off. It was, they believed, the perfect setting for another routine purification. Mary Catherine's labor was difficult and prolonged, lasting nearly 24 hours while the storm screamed outside. The sisters worked by the flickering light of candles, their faces illuminated by dancing flames that cast monstrous, shifting shadows on the cabin walls. When the baby finally emerged, Agnes immediately noticed the distinctive birthmark that covered the infant's right cheek and extended down his neck. The mark was dark and irregular, resembling what a superstitious mind might interpret as a clawed handprint. But Mary Catherine Sullivan was not like their previous victims' mothers. Despite her youth and exhaustion, she possessed a fierce Irish spirit that refused to be easily deceived. When Margaret began to move the baby away from her, claiming the need for a medical examination, Mary Catherine struggled to sit up, her voice firm with maternal instinct. "Give me my baby," she insisted. "I want to hold him now." The sisters exchanged a volley of frantic, meaningful glances, recognizing the telltale signs of a mother who would not be easily separated from her child. But they had committed themselves to their deadly mission, and the birthmark was too prominent to ignore. Agnes moved to distract Mary Catherine while Margaret prepared for the purification ritual. "You need to rest, dear," Agnes said softly, her features arranged into a mask of false concern. "Let us clean him properly, and then you can hold him." But Mary Catherine's instincts were fully aroused, and she could sense the wrongness in the room. "There's something you're not telling me," she declared, her Irish accent thickening with emotion. "What's wrong with my baby? Why won't you let me see him?" She attempted to rise from the bed, but Catherine moved to gently restrain her, speaking in low, soothing tones about the need for rest after a difficult labor. The sisters were trapped. They could not perform their ritual with Mary Catherine awake and alert, but they also could not allow the marked child to survive. In a decision born of panic and arrogance, Margaret determined to proceed with the purification despite the mother's presence, believing they could afterward convince her she had been delusional. What happened next would be seared into Mary Catherine's memory forever. As Margaret held the infant and began to place her hands over his nose and mouth, Mary Catherine caught a clear glimpse of the action in the reflection of a small mirror hanging on the cabin wall. She saw Margaret's deliberate, practiced movements, saw the way her newborn son struggled briefly before going still, and realized with a jolt of pure horror that she was witnessing the murder of her own child. "Sweet Jesus, what are you doing?" Mary Catherine screamed, her voice a shriek of terror that seemed to pierce the very walls of the cabin. She lunged forward with a superhuman strength born of rage and despair, breaking free from Catherine's grasp and reaching desperately for her baby. But it was too late. The infant was already dead, his tiny body limp in Margaret's arms. Confronted with a direct witness for the first time, the sisters were momentarily paralyzed. Mary Catherine fought like a wild animal, clawing and scratching at Margaret while screaming accusations in a torrent of English and Gaelic. They were forced to physically restrain her, holding her down while Margaret began the familiar, chilling litany of explanations about complications and divine will. But Mary Catherine was not to be convinced. She had seen the truth with her own eyes. "You killed my baby," she shrieked, her voice carrying across the silent, snow-choked landscape. "You're murderers. Devils. I'll see you all hang for this." The sisters faced their greatest crisis. Margaret, her religious mask slipping to reveal the cold, calculating killer beneath, made a fateful decision. Rather than attempting to permanently silence Mary Catherine, she chose to rely on the woman's vulnerable status as a foreign immigrant. "Who will believe you?" Margaret asked, her voice icy and calm. "You're a foreign woman, barely able to speak proper English, claiming that respected midwives are murderers. We've delivered hundreds of babies safely. You've just lost your mind with grief." The psychological warfare that followed was as cruel as the physical murder. For hours, the sisters worked to gaslight Mary Catherine, convincing her that she was delusional, that her grief had caused her to imagine horrors that never happened. They quoted scripture about the dangers of bearing false witness, reminded her relentlessly of their impeccable reputation, and suggested that her wild accusations would only bring shame and ruin upon herself and her husband. Agnes played her part to perfection, weeping manufactured tears of sympathy. "We've dedicated our lives to helping mothers and babies," she sobbed. "How can you say such terrible things about us? We're heartbroken that your baby couldn't survive, but you mustn't blame us for God's will." Their manipulation was devastatingly effective. Mary Catherine, isolated in a foreign land with no family support and limited English, began to doubt her own senses. The sisters' reputation seemed to contradict the terrifying image burned into her memory. Perhaps her grief had conjured phantoms. But deep in her heart, a kernel of certainty remained. She knew her baby had been murdered, and she knew the Morrison sisters were monsters in angels' clothing. She also understood she had no power, no evidence, and no one who would believe her. The sisters allowed Mary Catherine a brief, supervised moment to hold her dead son, watching coldly as her grief poured out. They spoke their familiar platitudes about God's mysterious will and the blessing of a heavenly salvation. They offered to handle the burial and even magnanimously waived their fee, adding a final, insulting layer to their performance. When Patrick Sullivan fought his way through the snowdrifts the next morning, the sisters met him with their well-rehearsed story. They spoke of tragic complications and a son called home to God. They carefully mentioned Mary Catherine's grief-induced delusions, preemptively discrediting any story she might tell. Patrick, overwhelmed by sorrow and confused by his wife's wild state, accepted their explanation completely. He thanked them for their kindness. The baby became the 63rd victim in the secret cemetery. But the Sullivan case had shaken the sisters to their core. They had been directly confronted, and although they had survived, they realized how perilously close they had come to the gallows. In the aftermath, they implemented new precautions, developing methods to ensure mothers remained unconscious and creating even more elaborate lies. But they had created their most dangerous enemy, a living witness who knew the truth and would never, ever forget. You know, stories like this make you wonder how many other terrible secrets are buried in the isolated corners of America, hidden behind a facade of authority and respectability. If you're finding this tale as deeply disturbing as I am, hit that like button and let me know in the comments what you think about the Morrison sisters' chilling ability to manipulate their victims. Are you brave enough to hear what happens when their secret finally begins to unravel, when the threads of their deception start to pull apart? Subscribe to join the few who dare to uncover these dark truths, and let's continue this horrifying journey together. The psychological impact of the Sullivan case would fester within the sisters for years, creating fatal cracks in their unified front. But in the immediate aftermath, their response was to become even more meticulous and ruthless in their deadly work, setting the stage for their eventual, inevitable exposure.